So now, I'd like to introduce our featured speaker tonight. Nathan Pieplow works to unlock the secret language of birds. Nathan is the author of the Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds, which is an accessible and entertaining introduction to the fascinating topic. An avid bird sound recordist and videographer, he is the author of Bird Sound Blog, and I'll put that in the chat as well, but it's earbirding.com/blog. A board member of the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies, an author of the Colorado Birding Trail, and former editor of the journal Colorado Birds. He teaches writing and rhetoric at the University of Colorado, Boulder. Nathan, welcome.
Thank you so much. It is a thrill to be here. Let me see if I can get my slides shared. All right. That should be working, yes?
Yes.
Fantastic. All right. So thank you so much for having me. I wish I could be out there in person. It's nice to talk to you via Zoom. I did get the chance to visit Morro Bay a couple of years ago, and it was wonderful, and I would love to make it back there at some point. I have never been during the festival, so I'm going to have to make that happen. On my screen right now, you see a lovely little yellowthroat, and I'm going to just play his song real quick, and you can adjust your volume accordingly. And up there above my name on the screen, you'll see these squiggles. And that is actually the bird song that you just heard. That is the song of this male yellowthroat in picture form. We call that a spectrogram. People sometimes ask me how I wrote a field guide to bird sounds if you can't describe bird sounds very well. And the answer is you can use spectrograms. They are computer-generated graphs of the sound. It's the same basic principle as reading music. It goes from left to right. The high notes are at the top, the low notes are at the bottom. We're not going to spend any time tonight learning how to read spectrograms. But from time to time during tonight's presentation, you may see some weird squiggles appear when a bird is singing. And if that happens, I just want you to know that what you're looking at is a picture of the sound. I always like to say that the birds are always telling us who they are and what they're doing. The problem is that a lot of us don't speak bird. Here's an example of a bird telling us who it is and what it's doing. That bird just told you that it was a red-winged blackbird. It also told you that it was a male. It also told you a few other things, which we'll get to in a minute. That bird also just told you it was a red-winged blackbird. It told you it was a female, and it told you a few other things, which we'll get to in a minute. We can learn what the birds are saying, and then we can figure out what's going on in their lives. For example, that is a cliff swallow. You may be familiar with cliff swallows. They like to nest in large colonies under bridges. If you walk up underneath the bridge where all the cliff swallows are nesting, they will fly out in a big cloud over your head and circle around you saying this. Because that little zoo sound is the word in cliff swallow language that means danger. But cliff swallows have other words in their language as well, like this one. That is a sound that cliff swallows only make on cool, cloudy days. Because on cool, cloudy days, it becomes difficult to be a cliff swallow. Cliff swallows feed on swarms of flying insects, and when it's rainy and misty and foggy, the insects don't really like to fly. So what happens on those days is that the cliff swallows fan out from their colony in different directions, hoping that one of them will get lucky and actually find a swarm of flying insects that is flying in spite of the weather. If they do, they make this sound, and that immediately recruits all the other colony members within earshot to come as quickly as possible and take advantage of that swarm of flying insects while it is still on the wing. Now, it's possible that other species of swallows have food finding calls like the cliff swallow, but if they do, we don't know about it. The only reason we know about this word in cliff swallow language is because there was one researcher who kept returning to study the same colony of cliff swallows in Nebraska every summer for 24 years. And somewhere around year 14, they discovered this call and they did a pretty ingenious set of experiments to demonstrate exactly what it means and how it functions for cliff swallows. Very few birds in the world have been studied that well, which means that if you ask me what most birds in the world are saying, I'll have to say, I don't know. More study needed. Because there are actually not very many birds that we've spent enough time studying that we can actually unravel their language. This is actually one of the things that I love most about bird sounds, because whenever you are studying bird sounds, you are standing right at the edge of human knowledge. And that means it's pretty easy to contribute to human knowledge and find out something that nobody's ever known before. I love to say that it is way easier for anybody on this Zoom call here today to go out in their backyards and make a recording of a bird sound that's never been recorded before than it is for anybody to take their camera anywhere in the world and photograph a bird that's never been photographed before. We're going to talk a little bit later tonight about some of the ways in which you could actually contribute to our knowledge of bird sounds. And it's also something we could potentially talk about after the talk during the Q&A. Tonight, we're going to talk about what birds are saying to one another, which means we're going to stick to some species that really have been well studied so that we actually do have a pretty good handle on their vocal communication and what they're saying to one another, which is why we're going to come back to this pair of red-winged blackbirds that we met earlier. In fact, we're going to come back multiple times to these red-winged blackbirds, in part because it is a really well-studied bird, so we have a good handle on its vocal communication system. And also in part because red-winged blackbird is hands down the most vocally interesting species in North America. They have a lot to say to one another. So we're going to start with this male-female pair. Just in case you didn't know, mated pairs of male-female red-winged blackbirds very frequently duet with one another. If you have ever been near a marsh where red-winged blackbirds are breeding, I guarantee you have heard this duet many, many times. But it's likely that you might not have recognized that you were hearing a duet for a couple of reasons. First of all, you're probably familiar with the male red-winged blackbird's song. The male red-winged blackbird sings "Konkari." A lot of people know that song. You hear it all the time in the marsh when the red-winged blackbirds are breeding. The female song sounds completely different. It sounds more like cheer. And because it sounds so different, that's one of the reasons why people don't tend to recognize that the male and the female are actually duetting. Another reason people don't recognize it is because they don't sing at the exact same time. When they're duetting, the male starts singing, and halfway through his song, the female begins to sing. So he starts it, they overlap for a second in the middle, and then she finishes it out. So they're a little bit offset in time, and that makes it a little bit trickier to realize you're hearing a duet. The third reason that people don't realize they're hearing a duet is because when they're duetting, those two birds might not be side by side like I've pictured them on the screen. They might be 5 yards apart, or they might be 50 yards apart. The male might be up on the top of the cattail where you can see him. The female might be hidden down in the cattails near the nest. But if you hear this duet where the male starts his song and the female starts half a second after him, even if they are separated and out of eye shot of one another, you can be confident that you are listening to a mated pair. And it sounds like this. That is those two birds saying, I love you to one another. That is a pair bonding exercise between those two members of that pair. But when they duet, the male and the female red-winged blackbird are not just saying, I love you to one another. They're also sending a message to all the other red-winged blackbirds in the marsh. They're also saying, I'm taken. Or more precisely, they're saying, my mate is taken. So male red-winged blackbirds will mate with multiple females and defend each of those females against other males. And then female red-winged blackbirds typically mate with one male and defend their mate against other females. So whenever the male-female pair is duetting, they're saying, I love you to one another, and they're also advertising to all the other red-winged blackbirds in the marsh that this particular territory is taken up by a male-female pair, and there's no room for another male or another female right in this little territory. Something interesting about this duet is that related birds do the exact same thing. Meadowlarks do the exact same thing. The female has a rattle call. She starts it half a second after her mate starts singing. Those two birds could be 100 yards apart on the prairie, but they're still telling you that they're a mated pair. Brown-headed cowbirds do the exact same thing. The female has a rattle call. She starts it halfway through her mate's song. That's those two birds announcing that they are a mated pair. This is really good to know if you are doing, for example, breeding bird survey work or breeding bird atlas work, because if you understand when you're hearing these mated pair duets, you can actually more easily determine that you have a pair. Interestingly, male red-winged blackbirds actually have two different kinds of songs. That konkari song is the most common one that most people hear all the time. They also have a much less common song that is only given a few times a day by any given male, typically. And it's called the flight song because it's almost always given in flight. We don't have a super great understanding of exactly what the flight song means, but here's our best guess. That flight song is usually given when a male is flying away from his territory. So our best guess as to what it means is that he is signaling to his mate that he's leaving the territory for a little while, and she's going to have to hold down the fort while he's gone. We're not 100% sure that that's exactly what it means because they don't give it every time they fly off their territory. And sometimes they give it when they're flying back to their territory. So the meaning is a little bit fuzzy. You may have thought when you were hearing that flight song that it was basically just a series of call notes, which it basically is. Different call notes strung together, usually with a couple of those seer, seer whistles in the middle. But each individual male red-winged blackbird has his own distinctive flight song with its own distinctive combination of call notes. And it identifies him uniquely in his marsh. He's the only one who has that particular flight song. Female red-winged blackbirds also have two different kinds of songs. The first one is the one we've already heard, the I love you / I'm taken song. But they also have a more aggressive song that they'll give when they are trying to drive another female out of their territory. You can hear that aggressive song sounds harsher, and it's got this kind of more aggressive quality to it. Interestingly, female red-winged blackbirds can actually mix and match the notes from those two different kinds of songs. So I think that they can kind of express a full range of emotions between I love you and get out of my territory just by kind of mixing and matching the song notes from those two different styles of song. In bird language, sometimes one sound can have many meanings, which isn't too strange because human language works the exact same way. So for example, in English, we have a number of words that sound the same, but mean different things. And so when we hear one of those words in conversation, we figure out which meaning is intended from context. Birds do the exact same thing. So for example, here's a little ruby-crowned kinglet. When he's up in the mountains in the summer breeding, he's got a long, complicated, beautiful song that he sings. He's got a couple other kinds of calls that he makes. He's got a large vocabulary in the summertime. But when he comes down to the coast in the winter, or down to the southern part of the country in the winter, almost all winter long, all that ruby-crowned kinglets say is that little chit, chit, chit call note. It sounds like this. That little chit, chit, chit has to do multiple things for a ruby-crowned kinglet all winter long. First of all, it's a contact call that keeps the members of a flock together. So in that context, it means I'm over here. But it also is the alarm call that warns of danger. And it's also the mobbing call. So if the ruby-crowned kinglet finds a pygmy owl, for example, and wants to recruit other small birds to come closer and help drive away the pygmy owl, it's also going to use this chit, chit, chit call to do that as well. So how do the other birds know which meaning is intended? Just like us, they're going to pay attention to context. They're going to pay attention to whether this ruby-crowned kinglet seems agitated, whether his red crest is raised or lowered, whether he's continually orienting in one direction as if there's a predator over there, whether he's foraging nonchalantly, whether the calls sound rapid and excited or whether they sound kind of slower and more regular. The birds around are going to pay attention to all of those things. And from that context, they're going to figure out what chit, chit, chit it means in this moment. Again, that's not too strange because, like I said, human language works the exact same way. But in bird language, if one sound can have many meanings, it's also true that sometimes one meaning can have many sounds. And to illustrate this point, I'm going to use the bird species that, as far as we know, has the largest vocabulary of any bird species in the world. And it's not a mockingbird, by the way, although it is a relative of the mockingbird. Before I reveal which species it is, I'm going to just remind you that those little words, as far as we know, are doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Because, as I mentioned, out of the over 10,000 bird species in the world, only a small fraction of them have been really well studied. So it's very possible that there are other bird species out there with even larger vocabularies than the one I'm about to show you. But this is the bird species that currently is the record holder for largest vocabulary. It's not typically found in California, but it is common in the eastern United States. It is the brown thrasher. So brown thrashers sing a song of one song phrase that lasts about a second, and then they pause for about a second, and then they sing a different song phrase for about a second, and then they pause for about a second, and so on and so forth. I'm going to play you a little snippet of brown thrasher song, and I want you to listen and try to figure out if the bird ever repeats a song phrase. You just heard a brown thrasher singing for 40 seconds, and the bird never repeated a song phrase during that time. So researchers wanted to know, how many song phrases does one brown thrasher know? How big is that vocabulary? So a researcher named Donald Kreutzma and one of his graduate students went out onto the campus of the University of Massachusetts, and they found a singing brown thrasher, and they recorded its song for 113 straight minutes. So it's just shy of 2 hours. And then they took that long recording back into the laboratory, and they attempted to estimate how many song phrases that individual bird knew. And when they were done with their estimates, their best guess was that that individual brown thrasher knew between 2,000 and 2,500 different song phrases. Just to put that in perspective, your vocabulary as an adult speaker of English is probably on the order of 25,000 words. So here's a bird that has a vocabulary maybe 10% the size of yours, and its brain is the size of your fingernail. That's astonishing. But as far as we know, brown thrashers might be saving some brain space when they're remembering all of those words, because as far as we've been able to tell, every single word in brown thrasher language means the exact same thing. Every single one of those song phrases means, I'm a brown thrasher and I'm looking for someone to share my territory with. Which immediately raises the question, why do you need 2,500 different ways to say that? And the answer is, we have no idea. Science has no idea how the brown thrasher's vocabulary got so big or what's keeping it so big. Just to put it in perspective again, this is 10 times larger than a mockingbird's vocabulary. Mockingbirds know on average 250 different phrases, and here's a bird with 10 times more than that. Now, if you ask most ornithologists, how did the brown thrasher's vocabulary get so big? What's keeping that vocabulary so big? The standard answer that you're going to hear is sexual selection, also known as female choice. The basic idea being that at some point in the evolutionary history of the brown thrasher, females developed a preference for males who did not repeat themselves. And then the idea would be that the females are constantly choosing the males with the larger vocabularies. And so those are the males that pass on their genes to the next generation. And over time, the vocabulary gets bigger and bigger. Here's the problem with that theory. In order for that to be true, then if a female has a choice between a male with 2,500 song phrases in his vocabulary and a male with 2,200 song phrases in vocabulary, that female has to consistently choose the 2,500 phrase singer, which would require that female to listen to everything that came out of both of their mouths for hours, if not days, and remember it all so that she recognizes when one of them begins to repeat. We are pretty sure that the females are not actually putting in that kind of effort. That doesn't seem reasonable. And so if they're not doing that, then we don't understand how the females are choosing their mates. And that means we don't understand how that vocabulary got so big or what's keeping it so large. I love this example because this is a super common bird that lives in tons of people's backyards everywhere in the eastern half of the US. And here's a very basic idea, very basic question about its singing behavior that we have not yet answered. This is a great example of the kinds of things we could learn if more of us were just paying more attention, making recordings with our phones, uploading those recordings to eBird, putting in notes, collecting data. That's one of the great things about recording bird sounds and uploading bird sounds is that we can actually contribute to answering questions like this one. So we've talked about how in bird language, sometimes one word can have many meanings. And we've talked about how sometimes one meaning can have many sounds. And sometimes it's complicated. And our example for this is going to bring us back to our old friends, the red-winged blackbirds. Only this time we're going to be talking about call notes instead of song. So the male red-winged blackbird, whenever he's not nest building or feeding or doing something else, he's probably sitting on top of a cattail stalk in the marsh, giving call notes over and over, giving call notes about 2 to 5 seconds apart. That's what they do in their spare time. And these calls are called alert calls. Most of them sound like chuck, and a couple of them will kind of sound like seer. And these chuck and seer calls, each individual male knows between 12 and 20 different alert calls, some variations on chuck and seer. Here's what some of these calls might sound like. So there's 10 different alert calls from a male red-winged blackbird. That could be half of this male's vocabulary of 12 to 20 total chuck and seer calls that he knows. What you'll find if you move all around the country is that in any given marsh where red-winged blackbirds breed, you'll find that all the male red-winged blackbirds in that marsh, they all share a vocabulary of the same 12 to 20 alert calls. They all agree on 12 to 20 different alert calls that they're going to use in that marsh. Whereas if you drive 30 or 50 miles down the road to another marsh, you'll find that the 12 to 20 alert calls in that marsh are different. They are shared among all the males who share the marsh, but they differ from marsh to marsh. So there's geographic variation. But within a given marsh, they tend to agree on 12 to 20 alert calls. And what they'll do is at any given moment in time, they'll pick one of the 12 to 20 that they know, and they will all give that exact same call. One bird will give it, and another bird will give it, and a bird over here will give it, and they'll kind of echo each other all around the marsh, just giving the same call out of their vocabulary that they've all somehow settled on together. Researchers noticed that when danger would show up, like when a hawk would appear or when a human would walk into the marsh, the calls changed. And so that suggested a reason why these birds might have 12 to 20 different alert calls. Maybe those different calls send different messages. Maybe the different calls stand for different kinds of predators. Or maybe the different calls refer to the direction that the danger is coming from. Or maybe those different kinds of calls refer to the level of danger and talk about how pressing the threat is. Researchers wanted to get to the bottom of this, so they got themselves a stuffed Cooper's hawk and they put it on a stick. And then they got themselves a bed sheet and a really long string so that they could go out into the marsh with this stuffed Cooper's hawk and stick it in the marsh on a pole right in front of the favorite nesting perch of a red-winged blackbird. And then they could cover the hawk with the bedsheet and retreat a long distance with that string so that at their leisure, they could yank on the string, whip that bedsheet off of the hawk. And from the perspective of that male red-winged blackbird, it would be like a Cooper's hawk suddenly appeared right in front of his perch. And the researchers then were recording the calls that the males made before and after the hawk appeared to try to figure out which of these calls maybe means Cooper's hawk. So for example, let's say all the males in the marsh have chosen this call. They're all echoing it all around the marsh. And then the researchers whip that bedsheet off of that hawk and the calls change. The first male red-winged blackbird to see the hawk changes to the seer call. And as soon as that first blackbird to see the hawk changes to the seer call, all the other males in the marsh immediately follow suit. So the researchers thought, okay, maybe that seer call, maybe that means Cooper's hawk. So they tried the experiment again. Let's say before the hawk shows up, all the males are giving this call all around the marsh. The bedsheet comes off, and the males switch to that call. Let's try the experiment again. Before the hawk shows up, all the males are giving this call. The hawk appears, and the males switch to that call. As they did this experiment over and over again, what the researchers eventually figured out was it doesn't matter which call the red-winged blackbirds switch to when the hawk appears. What matters is that they switch calls. In other words, any call repeated over and over again in red-winged blackbird language means all clear. And any switch from one call to another means danger. When I found out about this, it completely blew my mind. I love this example because it reminds me that bird language is much, much stranger than we tend to suppose. I've been using this word bird language all night, but there is no bird language. There are actually over 10,000 different bird languages because every single species of bird on Earth has had to come to its own solution to the problem of how to communicate using sound. And some of them have found solutions to the problem that are radically different from our solutions. I love to be reminded by nature that there's way more variety out there than we tend to admit or see. And that the way that we see the world, the way that we communicate, is not necessarily the same way that other animals do. This is a wonderful example that teaches us that, reminds us of that. And that brings me to the bird song field guides that I wrote. The Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds of Eastern and Western North America. I intended them to be a dictionary for the language of the birds. So whenever we do know how these sounds are actually used in real life, I tried to put that into the book. Of course, the words "more study needed" appear on every single page, I think, because there's so much more that we have to learn. But to the extent that we do know what each species is saying, I tried to put that in the book. Another thing I tried to do in the book was establish a standard vocabulary that we can all use when we're talking about sounds. We have a standard vocabulary that we use to talk about how birds look. For example, we all agree on the names of the colors. We all agree on the names of the parts of a bird. There's actually a diagram at the start of every field guide to teach you the names of the parts of the bird. And we all agree on the difference between visual patterns. Like we agree, for example, on the difference between a spot and a stripe. There's no reason we can't do the same thing for sounds. It's just that we haven't. We haven't sat down and said, this is what we're going to call this, and that's what we're going to call that. So that's what I intended to do in my book. I tried not to invent too many new words. I tried to take the words that we already use to describe bird sounds and define them precisely on the spectrogram so that we know exactly what we're talking about. I also wanted people to be able to compare similar sounding species. So in the field guide, if you go to the red-winged blackbird song, the male's konkari, down at the lower right, you'll see a page number that will send you to an index at the back of the book, and it'll list all the species that sound similar to that. And that indexing happens for every sound in the book. And the beautiful thing about that is that it actually allows you to look up a sound that you don't know, the same way that you would look up a word in the dictionary, as long as you can spell it. So the inside back cover of the field guide asks this question: what did you hear? That left-hand column is all the single notes. If you heard a single note from a bird, you would match what you heard to one of those descriptions, and then it would send you to those index pages to figure out exactly which bird you might have heard. The second column is if you heard the same note repeated over and over again in a series or a trill. And then the right-hand page is all the more complicated song patterns than that. Now, the beautiful thing that we can do nowadays is we can actually use our phones to identify birds and to make spectrograms of bird sounds in real time. What you're seeing there on the screen is my favorite spectrogram app called Song Sleuth, which is unfortunately no longer supported, but it was really good at making spectrograms. You can also use the Merlin app, which many of you are probably familiar with. The Merlin app also creates real-time scrolling spectrograms, although they're smaller and you can't just stop them when you want to. But it is recording, so you can go back to them or download them later and look at the spectrograms there. But if you get one of these apps that will actually create the real-time spectrogram, you can just hold your phone up to a singing bird and the bird will sign its name right on your phone. You just have to know the shapes. And if you have the shape of the spectrogram, you can actually use that to identify the bird using the Peterson Field Guide to Bird Sounds. You're just matching a picture to a picture, which is what field guides have always been about. And so it turns audio identification into a visual practice, which makes it a lot easier for a lot of us. A lot of us are much better visually than we are with hearing. And so making spectrograms of bird sounds and then using those to identify the bird sounds, if you have a spectrographic field guide, is actually really, really helpful. Merlin also will just identify birds for you straight up. It's pretty good at that. It doesn't know every species. It doesn't know every single sound of every species. Sometimes it will make mistakes. Sometimes it can be fooled. But in general, it's pretty good. And it's a good tool to use, especially if you're learning. So in general, I'm in favor of Merlin. And we can talk more about Merlin in the Q&A if you're interested. I should mention there's a website that accompanies my book. It's petersonbirdsounds.com. It is free for anyone to use. No purchase of the book is necessary. You can go there anytime you want and stream audio of over 7,500 bird sounds. If I do say so myself, it is the largest and most and best curated collection of bird sounds ever assembled for North America. The website looks like this. If you type in the species name, it will give you all these different audio files for each species. These are the ones for northern mockingbird. And then if you click on one of those, it will play the sound and it will scroll the spectrogram as the sound plays. And you can actually see what the sound looks like and hear what it sounds like at the exact same time, which is a terrific way to start to learn spectrograms and start to learn how to match those shapes with those sounds. So that brings me to the end of my prepared remarks for this evening. I would like to thank you for having me, and I would like to thank all the people here on the screen for their audio and their photos. And I am now going to open it up for Q&A, and I will let the folks here at Morrow Audubon decide how long we go. I will talk about bird sounds all night. So you will get sick of this before I do. I will let you decide how long we go.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Nathan. We really appreciate it. I wish it was daylight outside so I could go out and listen to some birds and try and figure out what they're saying. Yeah, my mind is going on this. So thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, please write them in the chat. Send it to me and we'll get some questions up there. There was one question, it wasn't about the presentation, but it was asking if there would be an opportunity for members to openly discuss the name change. And we don't have any open forum to discuss that, although there is a lot of information available to help allow you to make your own decision. Okay, and so we have a question, Nathan, coming in. It's how do we share sounds like we share IDs on iNaturalist?
So that's a good question. First of all, you can actually share bird sounds on iNaturalist. That's the first thing I'll say. You can just upload bird sounds, and people like me will go in there and listen to them and put IDs on them. And then once you get two IDs on two people agreeing on the ID on iNaturalist, it becomes, what's it called? Research grade. Um, so iNat is one option. Another great place to go is called Xenocanto, and I can type that in the chat because it's a little bit odd. But if you go to this website called xenocanto.org, you can upload your bird sounds there, and you can also upload various other kinds of animal sounds from around the globe. And at Xenocanto, if you have a bird sound that you don't know what it is, you can upload it as an unknown, and then it'll be just like iNat, where people will come by and listen to it and try to tell you what the identification is. The difference there is that it doesn't automatically update the identification the way iNat does. So people will tell you what they think the bird sound is, and then it's up to you to go in and change the ID. Um, and then you can also upload your sounds to eBird, and I do highly recommend that if you know what the ID is. But the difference there is that eBird does not have a good mechanism for identifying sounds that you don't know what they are. So if you don't know what the sound is, I would put it either on iNat or on Xenocanto. And then maybe once you figure out what it is, then you can put it up on eBird.
Great. Hey, Joanne has a question for you. She said, how did you get start researching bird sounds? And which one is the most challenging?
All right, those are two very different questions. The easy question, how did I get started? So I've been interested in birds since I was a kid. And uh, when around about 2003, I would have been in my early 20s, late 20s, and I was going down to Mexico for the first time. And people told me when you get to the rainforest, before you get to the rainforest, you need to study the sounds really well because you're not going to see a lot of birds. You're going to hear more than you see. And so I studied and I had this CD of Mexican bird sounds and I wrote all these notes in a notebook. And my friend and I went down there and he had a portable CD player with portable speakers. This was state of the art in 2003. And and I had my notebook and we walked into the rainforest and we heard the first bird and we turned to each other and we said, that was on the tape. We knew it was one of the species that we had studied, but we couldn't remember which one. And I started looking through my notes. I couldn't find it. We realized immediately that we couldn't just flip through 99 tracks on the CD. That was useless. So like we were stumped. To this day, I don't know what we heard. But in that moment, I had this realization. I was like, I should have indexed my notes. If I had indexed my notes, then I could look this sound up. And then that was the moment in which I realized that a field guide to bird sounds was possible. And I needed one. And I was looking for a writing project. And this just seemed like the right thing. At the time I set out to write the field guide, I was not qualified to write it. I was no expert in bird sounds. I had never recorded a bird sound. I had never made a spectrogram, didn't know how to read spectrograms. It took me 16 years from then to publishing the second field guide. Uh, so that was a long time and a long journey, and I'm super proud of it. And I'm done writing books about bird sounds. Um, very, very proud of it, and also I'm very satisfied with it. Second question, what is the most challenging bird sound I've encountered? I'm not even quite sure what that means. Challenging to record, challenging to remember. There's lots of different challenging bird sounds. Uh, there's some that are hard to hear. There's the double clap of the Franklin's spruce grouse, which I've never heard. You have to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time to hear that. I would love to hear that at some point. Um, there are challenging bird sounds like high pitch sounds that I can't hear. because I'm losing my high-pitched hearing, like a lot of people. Um, so there are birds. I mean, it's for me, it's just tough to hear chickadees and blue-gray gnatcatchers, because they're just a little bit too high for me most of the time. I can hear them if I'm really close, but my friends can hear them much farther away than I can, which is unfortunate. So, and then there's lots of bird sounds that I can't really identify. I can't identify all those little flight calls. Most of the warbler chips. I can get the really easy ones, but like I know people who are way better at warbler chips and flight calls than I am. Like I said, I need a field guide. I need a book. I wrote it all down so I wouldn't have to remember it.
Great. And I can't hear some of those high-pitched ones either. So Eric asked, there's some quiet birds out there like turkey vultures. Do you have any thoughts about quiet birds?
Quiet birds. That's a really good question. Okay, so turkey vulture is a great example, right? You've seen thousands of turkey vultures. I guarantee you've almost certainly never heard one. I've never recorded a turkey vulture. It's really difficult to record it. You basically have to be near a nest, and nests are hard to find of turkey vultures. If you get near the nest, then the young will hiss at you. But that's about all that turkey vultures can say. Black vultures are about the same because, birds have a vocal organ called a syrinx. You and I have a larynx. It's up here in our throat. Birds have a syrinx, which is down inside their chest at the Y junction where the trachea splits into two bronchi, one to go to each lung. And there's various numbers of muscles that attach to the syrinx. And the more muscles that a bird has attached to the syrinx, the more it can do with its bird song. So what we call the songbirds, which is everything from the vireos to the end of the book in the field guide, they have like tons of muscles attached to their syrinx. That's actually one of the things that makes them classified as songbirds, or what we call the Oscine passerines. Um, they have the most ability to make really complex sounds. And vultures have no muscles attached to their syrinx. So they have a syrinx, but they can barely use it. And basically all they can do is grunt and hiss. And there's a few other birds that are in this category, like the pelicans, for example. So you really are almost never going to hear a pelican making a sound unless you're right at the nest. The young will screech in the nest, but these are silent birds for the most part as adults. Vultures and pelicans and a few other birds like wood storks don't make much sound, but they do clap their bills, for example. Um, so it's wildly different. Some birds are almost silent. Some birds are not at all silent. Some birds make a lot more noise than we give them credit for, but only if you're near a nest. So, for example, cormorants and herons can be very noisy, including as adults. They can have complicated vocal displays, but you don't typically hear them most of the time around when they're foraging. So,
Great, thanks. Peggy asks, many times there's more than one bird singing at the same time. How do you separate the songs?
sometimes it's difficult to separate the songs, but when you're out in the field, you have usually information from your ears about which direction the sounds are coming from. And so that makes it a lot easier to separate one sound from another. If this thing is, you can hear it from off to your left, and another thing you can hear from off to your right, or something sounds close and another thing sounds far. That your brain automatically starts classifying locations. And so that really makes it easier to separate bird sounds. It can be very, very difficult to separate bird sounds when you're listening to a recording and it's not in stereo, it's just one microphone and all the birds are, suddenly jumbled together. You don't have any directions on any of them. It makes it more challenging. So the best way to separate birds singing at the same time is to pay attention to where they're singing from and then keep listening. Because if you listen over and over again for several minutes, eventually those birds are going to be singing separately and not exactly overlapping. And so you'll start to be able to hear one of them clearly if you just listen long enough.
Yeah, great idea. Uh, Many people are inviting you to the Winter Bird Festival. You heard that before we started, and you're hearing it again now in the comments. So you're always welcome to come to the Winter Bird Festival. It looks like Cameron asked, is there a correlation between visually brilliant birds and less vocabulary? He's thinking about female selection and the emphasis on visual versus sound.
Um, I'm probably going to have to say no. Uh, I mean, I haven't done that study, and I'm not sure if anybody has done that study. Um, but I can certainly think of drab birds with big vocabularies and wonderful songs like wrens, for example. And I can think of drab birds with very boring sounds like, you know, yes, flycatchers are medium boring. Um, House sparrows actually have a fair amount going on in their songs that we don't hear because we're hearing like a sped up version. But there's lots of birds that have fairly low vocabularies that are dull, and then there's lots of birds that are visually striking and also have tremendously complex vocabulary. So hummingbirds are a great example. Anna's hummingbird has a really long, complex song. Many North American hummingbirds don't, but when you get down to the tropics and all the hummingbirds are in every color of the rainbow, most of those birds have pretty complex songs, like radio static kind of songs, kind of like Anna's hummingbird. Um, so that's just one example. I can think of brilliant birds with very simple voices, brilliant birds with very complex voices, dull birds with very simple voices, dull birds with very complex voices. So I'm not sure I see uh, that correlation. There's just a lot of other stuff going on there, I think.
Yeah. So Anne said, other than having your book, which I think she meant in addition to having your book, are there techniques you use to help you remember the sounds in sequence?
Yes. Um, so a lot of people, if you ever take a bird sound identification workshop or bird sound identification course, or if you download like a bird sound identification app, almost all of those techniques are just some form of memorization, some form of memorization trick or memorization technique, or just drilling practice. They're trying to get you to memorize certain sounds and then just remember them, which if you can do it, it works beautifully. I know people who have really good auditory memories, like the auditory version of a photographic memory. They have tapes of birds they can play in their heads. If you can do that, fantastic. You're going to remember all the bird sounds if you work at it. I can't really do that very well, and I think a lot of us can't. A lot of us have trouble with that.
Mhm.
Um, and so when I teach people how to do identification, I'm teaching them shortcuts. I'm teaching them like analytic things to remember, so that you don't have to remember a sound. Instead, you remember kind of like a rule. I like to think of them as heuristics. So, for example, when I'm thinking of the call notes of hummingbirds, for example, which, by the way, is a fantastic way to identify hummingbirds. If you can remember their call notes, you'll see this little female coming into the feeder. And if she says something, you'll be like, oh, that's a black-chinned. And it'll look like magic to your friends. But it's actually just remembering the audio because many of the species sound different. And so I just have to remember the ones that don't sound different, right? So Rufus and Allens and Broad-tailed basically sound the same as one another. But then Black-chin sounds really different, and a lot of the ones down in Southeast Arizona sound really different. And so when you're in one of those situations, if you just remember which ones are different, you can identify those like this. And then the ones that sound the same, you just like, okay, I need to take a look at that one and actually use my binoculars on that one. So that's a trick I use that makes me look like an expert when I'm really just remembering a couple simple rules.
Yeah, by the way, you are an expert. So just in case you wanted to know.
But it's not
Uh,
all real. It's important to know.
Pamela asked, can any app identify which bird a mockingbird is mimicking?
For better or for worse, the answer is yes. So Merlin will get fooled by mockingbird imitations. So if you're listening to a mockingbird and it starts imitating a killdeer, and you've got Merlin up on your phone, a lot of times it'll say, "Oh, I hear a killdeer." It'll put killdeer up there. Starts imitating a Cassin's kingbird, Merlin will be like, "I hear a Cassin's kingbird." So it Merlin actually goes past mockingbird and is telling you what the bird is imitating. And uh, it doesn't always do it. It has to be a relatively good rendition, or it has to be a bird from that area. But yeah, a lot of times the apps will actually identify the sounds inside of the song. Um, there are lots of other species that incorporate a lot of imitations, but if they don't repeat it over and over again the way a mockingbird does, it can be much harder to pick it out. So lesser goldfinch, Lawrence's goldfinch, Cassin's finch are some birds that thick-billed fox sparrow. These are some birds that often stick a whole bunch of other imitated bird sounds into their songs, but often it's just one quick note before it's on to the next note. And so it can be really tough to pick those out. The apps have trouble picking those out. The human ear has trouble picking those out. The easiest way to do it is on a spectrogram if you know all the shapes and recognize, oh, that's a white-breasted nuthatch, but it's just a little tiny bit of white-breasted nuthatch jammed into the middle of somebody else's song.
Yeah, great. Let's see. Robbie's asking, can you talk a little bit about bird sounds that are made during fall and spring nighttime migration?
So if you're talking about night migrants, some birds, not all, migrate at night. And some of those birds, not all of them, will often call as they're moving overhead in the dark. And these are contact calls. These are like, I'm over here calls. Usually they sound something like seat. Depends on for warblers and sparrows and a lot of those kinds of birds, they sound like some kind of seat or seat call. And some of them you simply can't tell apart by ear. There are groups of birds that sound the same. So like Townsend's black-throated gray, hermit warblers, they all sound identical in their flight calls. But some of them are distinctive. So sometimes you can tell exactly what you're hearing going over. The thrushes are distinctive. They tend to call a lot at night, for example. Cuckoos sing or call at night as they're going over. And this is called, these are called nocturnal flight calls, NFCs. And there's whole like sections of the internet and sections of the birding universe dedicated to NFCs. There's all sorts of people who are really into this, including people who are not into like other forms of birding. They're really into this.
Mm.
Um, so I'm not great at identifying all the NFCs, and I get a little bit like um, I get bored quickly when I'm listening for them because they're all so high pitched that I can hardly hear them. So, if I'm with a friend with really good ears, they're going to hear 10 times more than I hear. And so I'm like, I get frustrated and I go to bed and decide I'm going to listen to the bird sounds in the morning.
Yeah. All right, thanks. And this is the last one, other than people saying thank you and that they love the talk. Uh, she was hoping to hear about communication between crows. They're so interactive and populate most of our suburbs.
Crows and ravens are amazing. If you don't know how smart crows and ravens are, just go look it up. Just go start reading about crows and ravens because they are frightening how intelligent they are. Uh, they remember individual humans. They will remember your face. They know whether you're friendly to crows or whether you're mean to crows, and they will tell other crows. Whether if you are mean to crows, they will tell other crows about you. Here's the thing. We know that there's an awful lot of information passing from one crow to the next, and nobody has come even close to cracking that code. We have no idea how they're actually passing that information. We know it must be going in their cause between one crow and the next. We know that individual crows recognize each other by sight and sound, just like you and I recognize each other by face and voice. Crows know each other. They all look the same to us. They all sound the same to us, but they know each other and they know who's who exactly in their flock. And somehow they're able to communicate lots of information to one another. And it all sounds like caw to our ear. Somewhere in that spectrogram, there must be the information like being encoded, and we have no idea where it is yet. So here's another fantastic, big, huge question of a super common bird that people hear all the time. There's a lot going on in crow and raven vocalizations, and we know almost nothing about it. People are trying to figure this out right now. People are doing a lot of research on crows and ravens because they're so interesting and so smart. But as far as I know, no one has come close to cracking the vocal code of those birds yet.
Well, I said that was the last question, but one more popped up, and they have a scrub jay in their yard, and it can sound like a frog. How common is it for them to be a mimic?
For scrub jays, so scrub jays are corvids. I would never put it past any corvid to not mimic, to not imitate. I'll use the word imitation instead of mimicry. Biologists tend to prefer imitation instead of mimicry because mimicry is a specific thing in biology. It's when one organism is trying to impersonate another organism, like the viceroy butterfly evolving to look like the monarch butterfly so that it won't get eaten. That's mimicry. What birds do is something different. They're not trying to be mistaken for one another. They're not trying to pass themselves off as the other species. They're instead most likely hearing something they liked and then remixing it into their own art, the same way that human musical artists will sample from other artists and hear something that they like grab a clip and like put it into their own song, but then make it into something new. Um, so scrub jays are not usually imitators, but every jay in North America sings sometimes a whisper song that is very complicated and includes a lot of imitations. We don't know exactly why they do that. It's not quite the same as song in other songbirds. It's not to advertise territory or anything like that. Seems to be mostly in the fall, seems to be mostly from potentially young birds, frequently solo birds, not very loud. Um, when those jays are doing whisper songs, they will imitate all sorts of species in the middle of that song, which means they have the capability to imitate and they could deploy those imitations whenever they feel like it. But as to when or why they would do that, again, we don't fully know. And one of the reasons we don't know is because jays and crows have really complex social lives and complex vocal behaviors, and it's not easy to just pin down what each word means. Some of the birds that I shared with you tonight, like cliff swallows, the reason we have a good understanding of their language is because their language is really simple. And when it gets complex, it gets much, much harder to figure out.
Well, that's it. So I'm sure that's not all of them, but that's where we are. We put the petersonbirdsounds.com link in the chat, the blog, your blog link in the chat. And I and everybody else just want to thank you. I think we had close to 80 plus people on tonight, and more people will be on the YouTube channel. So thank you so much for sharing what you know. And we really appreciate it. Thanks for everybody to show up tonight. Um, please take a look at our website and look forward to our next evening program. And thanks to everybody that helped put this on. So thank you, Nathan.
Thank you so much. It's been a thrill.